Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. Hopefully folks on the phone can hear me all right. My name is Ken Miller. I'm a soil scientist and agronomist working at Formation Environmental alongside John Dickey and others. And today we're going to brief you all on sort of, as Deborah mentioned, the status of the Groundwater Protection Program. Kind of give you an update on a few pieces here. Would you mind going to the next slide? One back. Yeah. So real briefly, we'll go over the general order requirements. What is the groundwater protection program for the orders? We'll talk a little bit about the formula and the values, and I'll define those and how we develop them. We'll also talk about what are called milestones, which are sort of interim performance goals for certain townships where the target may be particularly challenging. We developed milestones that are sort of intended to help move the industry towards the direction of achieving those targets. They don't apply for all townships because some townships don't need them. But where it seems beneficial or helpful, we put those in place. There's also the targets themselves. We'll try to put all this in context in terms of what it means for growers, what the next steps are, and talk a little bit about sort of some potential options for helping coalitions and growers achieve both the milestones and if we could just, I don't think this thing works. If we could just hop to the next slide, that'd be great. Perfect. So as folks probably know, all 13 water quality coalitions in the Central Valley that are subject to this order. The only that is not is Rice because they have different orders. But all other 13 coalitions collectively implemented the same approach for these three pieces of the groundwater protection process. And so what is the GWP? So it's basically comprised of, again, formula, values, and targets, right? And so what the formula is effectively just it's a characterization of what's going on in the root zone of irrigated agriculture, right? And so we basically take data and information that growers are reporting and some publicly available information like soils data. And we apply a method to that data to try to estimate how much nitrate is moving below the root zone and traveling towards groundwater. And so that's really what the formula is intended to do. And that estimate of how much nitrate is moving below the root zone is the value. All right. And so that's actually aggregated to the township scale. And so there's no sort of reporting of individual parcels. There's no real reporting of individual crops. It all is sort of aggregated up to a township scale number. And part of the reason for that is when we're talking about groundwater quality and impacts to groundwater, it's a regional type process, right? And so getting super granular in terms of reporting doesn't necessarily meet the objective of trying to protect a regional resource. And then finally, what targets are intended, they're basically the target for that township to ensure that it is, achieving compliance with the water quality objectives. Yeah. And so,
sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah.
Apologies. I am trying to, give me just a second. I'm trying to make it so that it won't.
And I can speak a little more to it. I've been through this a few times at this point. And so in terms of the formula, what did we use for our data and methods to characterize the root zone, to characterize irrigated agriculture? Yeah, perfect. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but we use grower reported INP data, right? So that's going to help us understand crop nitrogen applied, yield, and how much nitrogen is potentially left behind in the root zone. And then we use what's called the CV swap model, which I'll explain a little bit more about, but that's a process-based model that gives us a sort of the best estimate we can come up with in terms of how much nitrate is potentially loading below the root zone. And so the formula was approved by the regional board back in January of 21, which started a clock for us to compute the values, which we submitted in July of 21. They were conditionally approved of November that year, started a clock for computing targets, which we initially submitted July of 2022, had some conversations with the regional board staff, made some revisions to the report, and actually just resubmitted this past December. And so they're still in review with the regional board. They have not yet been approved. We're hopeful that they will be, but it at this point hasn't quite happened yet. And just kind of getting back to this schematic here, the values and formula and values very much root zone. But then when we talk about targets, we want to look at the whole picture, right? There's more than one piece of this pie that's going to impact water quality. And so in terms of how we assess the system, we want to look at sources of recharge. We want to consider if there's any transformations of nitrate in the beta zone or in the groundwater, and in whatever processes happen in the groundwater. So if you could just, there's a little bit of animation. So, but that's basically, yeah, I think that's basically the nuts and bolts of it. One key piece, and we'll hit on this again. Targets are to be reviewed and revised on a 5-year basis. And so what we've put forward is sort of, as a requirement, but we do anticipate that as more data and information become available, data get refined, talk a little bit about that. There is sort of opportunity to update these targets. And so they may evolve over time. Next slide, please. So with respect to the formula, I'll give you just a brief overview. You can go ahead. And maybe I can, you think, yeah.
Do you have the clicker? It should be working.
I don't know if this is right. Okay, maybe I can, this is,
Go right ahead.
I can do this. So real quick, what is CV SWOT, the Central Valley Soil and Water Assessment Tool? This was ultimately the tool that we use to characterize the root zone. SWOT it's a model that's been around for a long time, developed by USDA ARS and folks at Temple, Texas. It's widely used in the scientific community. Other agencies use it, federal agencies. So it's got a lot of credibility. It's free, publicly available. Anyone could download it today and look under the hood if they were interested. Going back a couple of years, actually the management practices evaluation programs, particularly the Southern, was awarded a grant through NRCS, $2 million grant. And part of that money helped fund the initial development of this model for the Central Valley context. So we could have taken it out of the box and not really looked at it very closely, but we knew we wanted to tailor things to California specific conditions and get it sort of as reflective as we could, integrate the best climate data, the best soil data, calibrate our crop models so that they're growing the way that they grow in the Central Valley. One of the nice things about SWOT is that it is physically based and pretty detailed spatially. So we can get, field scale sort of detail, and we can do that across the whole valley in a pretty manageable way. So there's sort of an advantage there. But it's simulating water and nitrogen cycles and processes. It kind of gives us a much more informed answer in terms of what happens to that nitrogen balance. So with the NMPs, we know applied and we know removed, but that doesn't necessarily equal leaching, right? And so we want to be able to get a better estimate of what is leaching. SWOT helps us do that. So it integrates climate, soil, there's an actual crop model. We detail out management. So we could change management in the future if we wanted to and see what the effects are. And again, it's very detailed. And so all these different pathways of nitrogen are actually being simulated in the model on a daily basis. And in terms of sort of just showing you kind of the extent of it, these yellow points here are CIMMYS stations that we're getting our climate data from. These detailed colorful polygons are all the different modeling units, different soil mapping polygons, all that detail sort of integrated into the model. So how do we compute, or how do we implement the formula and compute values? There's 3 basic steps. Get the data we need. We built what's called we call the root zone library. It's just a big database model runs. We opted to do all the modeling or most of the modeling up front, do it once, and then the coalitions can use it out into the future with sort of minimal upkeep. Is kind of the idea there. Once we have the root zone library, we compute the values. So I won't belabor all these points. Pulling data, soils, climate, INP data are critical. Basically what we do with the INP at this point is look at the whole range of different fertilizer rates, yields on a crop by crop basis that have been reported, so that we know what do we need to model, right? What's the range of things occurring on the valley floor that we want to simulate in our model? Once we know that, we basically automate SWOT, build out what we call crop books, which are just a bunch of model output for major crops within the Central Valley floor. Build that database. Then once we have the database, what we do is we take INP data, we match that to appropriate runs in the database and use that to compute the value. And I have another slide that shows this in a little more detail, but these are the three main steps. In terms of what crops we have modeled, based on INP reported data, we have just under 99% of what's reported actually having a model run in terms of acreage. So these are all the different crops that we have.
Do me a favor, Ken, and let Laura Brown.
Sure,
Apologize for that.
no problem. Yeah, so just the point here that we spent a lot of time and effort developing these various crop models, getting them to take up the appropriate amount of nutrients and water at the right time, developing the appropriate amount of yield, removing the appropriate amount of nitrogen with that yield. All that's been work done to this point. In terms of how we actually compute a value, this is just showing sort of an example township within the Central Valley floor. All these colorful polygons are unique modeling units, unique root zone models that we have in SWOT. And so if we were to just zoom in on an example township, these black outlines here are different parcels, right, that are going to have INPs associated with them. And you can see if we were to zoom in on one parcel in particular, there's actually 6 different soil types, you know, 6 different soil types within this parcel, right? And for each of these soil types, for each crop that's, you know, of substantial acreage, we have, you know, a couple hundred, if not many hundred, simulations of different N rates and different yields that are intended to reflect what could be in an INP report. So basically, again, this is the root zone library in essence. So for each soil, we have this for each crop. And so to actually compute a value, say for this parcel, what we do is we take the INP report. We know the APN, so we know where it is in space. We can assign the appropriate soils and climate. We know the crop, fertilizer rate, and we know the yield. So we go into our database, we say, okay, you know, on, you know, Hanford fine sandy loam, you know, there is carrot were grown and they put on this much fertilizer and they remove this much yield with harvest. So all that information guides which model runs we pull out of the database that has a leaching estimate associated with it. We do that for each soil within the parcel, roll that up to the parcel level by taking an average, and do that for every parcel in the township and roll that all up to an aggregate scale and take an average number for the township. And so it's reported at a township scale, but it's based on sort of field scale or even subfield scale type estimations. So any questions on any of that?
How often is the soils information updated in the model on a regular basis?
We don't update it regularly. NRCS does do, they do make updates from time to time, but in terms of valley floor information, that's relatively static at this point. There's not a whole lot of surveying and updating going on at this point. Yeah, so don't anticipate that changing a lot from year
But
to
I
year.
mean, I guess what we could anticipate is maybe refreshing that 5-10 years, something like that. That's about the speed at which things change enough to make a difference. Would be a guess.
It's a straightforward thing to do. A lot of the stuff is pretty automated at this point, so it wouldn't be a massive effort.
Some of the Temple, Texas folks we work with, that, you know, SWOT creators and the NRCS soil mapping folks, they've been super helpful in getting us databases that are particularly suited to this type of analysis. That they don't just look at sort of generic type of mapping data. They have pulled information from actual profile descriptions, and so they're watching that kind of thing. And I think that they're going to provide, you know, these databases get used by a lot of other people besides us. So when they provide updates, we'll use them.
Sure. Okay. So that's basically the formula, right? And then what are the values? Here's just showing a map of the values specific to King's Water Quality Coalition. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the context of milestones and targets shortly here. But you can see kind of, or you can try to see sort of the general distribution in terms of loading, some variability, a lot of townships falling somewhere between 20 and 30 or 30 and 40 pounds per acre on average, loading below the root zone, although there are some other townships that are higher than that. And just real briefly, in terms of what was reported in the values report back in 21, we did provide sort of detailed summaries on a township level as part of the request from the regional board for some level of transparency. So nothing specific to crops in that case, but just, you know, total nitrogen applied as per reported, total nitrogen removed as per reported, and then, you know, what happens to that A-R and SWOT, and just tabulating things so that they can see, you know, that we're not cooking the books and putting nitrogen where it probably isn't going. So sort of a gut check, if you will. On the crop side, they did require us to, at least at a watershed scale, summarize, you know, the main pathways of nitrogen for the top 5 crops by acreage. And so, you know, how much volatilization of ammonia and denitrification, basically nitrogen going up through the top and not going through the bottom. How much are we simulating there? You know, how much nitrogen are we simulating that stores inside the wood of the tissue? It's effectively not available for leaching. Are we building soil organic matter in the model? You know, effectively, where are we simulating this nitrogen to be going? And is that consistent with scientific literature? We did have to do some comparisons to other available information, literature and models. And so that is in there as sort of a validation component. But that work is sort of ongoing, and we could talk more about that later if we'd like. But sort of answer the mail, at least initially, in terms of demonstrating that, you know, SWOT is as robust as some other widely used models, and our results are consistent with California specific literature. We also, you know, modeling stuff, did a sensitivity analysis and documented all the model inputs and things like that, which you may not be particularly interested in. So now that's, you know, where we're at today. Irrigated ag, root zone, you know, targets is sort of where we need to try to get to, so that ag is being, you know, in compliance, being protective of water quality. And so what do we need to do? You know, we need to connect these values to other key pieces of information within the system, right? We need to put it in the context of everything else that's happening, right? And so that means accounting for hydrology, estimating other nitrate loads from other sources, so that we have a comprehensive map at the surface there. You know, considering post-root zone processes, where they occur, how much do they occur, groundwater processes, and then ultimately where we opted to assess water quality in this process was at sort of the virtual receptor, or the virtual wellhead, if you will, because that's the point at which water is actually being used for some beneficial use, like drinking water, right? So as opposed to assessing first encounter groundwater, we know things can happen within the aquifer system or within the well screen that are going to change the answer in terms of water quality. So we wanted to be able to kind of look at water quality at the point of use, if you will. And so we looked at it there. And to do that, we used a tool called the Non-Point Source Assessment Tool, or NPSAT. And I have a slide on that. And so what is NPSAT? This is a model that was developed by researchers over at UC. And so Thomas Harder and his team developed this tool with both state water board and federal funding. It was kind of the state's tool. We knew they'd be using it anyways. And so it's a robust tool. It's kind of state of the art. And so there was all the reasons to use it. And so we used it, and kind of at very little cost to the growers, I should mention.
Yeah, right. I just want to, just a little history on this. We all know the history of the Harder report. This was substantially after that. And we knew that Thomas had a high level of credibility with the agencies that regulate us. And he was quite interested in doing something like this. So we got in on the ground floor and talked to him extensively about how he might do it, and had a little bit of influence. Actually got named as partners on the project. That is, you know, your coalition and others. And then they've worked with us fairly closely as they've gone ahead and done it. And so I won't say it's completely fashioned for our use, but we made sure it was going to be highly usable for this type of thing. We basically, in the work plan we filed in 2017, something like that, that is the Southern Coalition's. We said that we would do something like this. We would connect a root zone model to a groundwater model, but we didn't have several $1 million to build a groundwater model or a groundwater tool set. Thomas was able to get, and we were able to help him get funding to do all that work. So that's cost so far, except for our time talking to Thomas from time to time and, you know, learning how to use the tools he built, it costs the coalitions nothing, which has been, and we're very, very happy with its features. So anyway, that's kind of the background on it, and it didn't just kind of come out of nowhere.
And so, you know, you can see in the image here, what NPSAT is doing for us is it's connecting what's leaving the root zone, what's going on in the surface. So this is actually looking up as if you were in the aquifer, looking up at the land surface. It's connecting what's happening there to these sort of virtual receptor wells in the aquifer, right? And so what's going into a well is a combination of different sources, takes a different amount of time to get there, different concentrations with those different sources. So it's doing all that. And it's doing it across many, many, many wells. And so you can see down here in the King Subbasin, all these red points are basically, they're reflective of DWR's domestic well data set, the well completion reports. That's where it comes from. But what you can see is there's a lot of coverage, particularly central towards the eastern side. But there's a lot of spatial coverage in terms of characterizing the aquifer. Another important point, you know, all the underlying hydrology, all the recharge, you know, all of that is based upon DWR's C2 VSIM fine grid. There is another version of NPSAT that's based on USGS's groundwater model, but given how dated that was, we opted to go with sort of the best, latest available information. But this is kind of one area where there's opportunity for refinement in the future. Right. So as you know, GSPs are implemented and water balances are sort of, you know, finalized, and we have a, you know, if there's a new picture in terms of how recharge looks on the landscape, that can get folded in and accounted for. But currently, you know, sort of all sources of recharge, if you will, are included in DWR's model, and so they're included in this assessment. In terms of setting targets, you know, there's different types of wells or virtual wells we could look at. And for setting targets, we looked at the virtual domestic wells, right? So all these red points, as opposed to looking at irrigation wells, municipal wells. So the idea there was these are sort of the most sensitive, you know, we have the most data points. That's where we focused on setting targets. And, you know, we call them virtual wells because the exact points are not known. DWR completion reports are accurate to the section level. So we know within a square mile where this well is, but within that square mile, it's just sort of randomly placed, but that's kind of just a distinction there. A couple of things to realize about NPSAT, you know, it's not accurate at the well level, right? So it's simulating, I don't know, just under 100,000 wells about, and the answer at any one well is not going to be 100% correct. And we never would claim it would be, nor would Thomas. Right. And so the way the tool actually gets used is sort of looking at a distribution of wells across a spatial area. Right. So looking at a couple hundred wells within a township or within a subbasin, for instance, and assessing that population and using some statistics on that broader population is the way in which this tool should be used. And then just by nature of how it's set up, it's very efficient to run well out into the future. And so we actually do that. The way that we run NPSAT is, you know, there's sort of, you know, historical loading estimates, which are, which are, you know, pretty uncertain, right? But what we do is, if you imagine this is, say, 1945, and then say somewhere around here is present time, you know, we warm up the model, but we run it out far enough into the future that basically things flatline in terms of concentrations across these wells. So these lines just represent different wells within a township, for instance. You have different concentrations at different wells. But we run it out long enough so that whatever is happening today in terms of loading is the only thing that's impacting this water quality. So we're not getting bogged down with what happened in the past. We're not trying to perfectly predict water quality today. We're trying to answer what are the impacts of today on future water quality. And that's what we need to work on, right? If we need to work on it. So it gets around sort of that.
When you have DWR well completion reports, are those for wells that are 20 years old, 50 years old? Does that include all wells ever dug or permits ever pulled on that?
That's right. So there are some that are potentially not real anymore.
Yeah, and that becomes garbage, and that's where when we have Sigma, they go back to those wells and say, oh, there's this many wells and this many can, you know,
Yeah,
you gotta take all the wells that are 20 years and younger.
we could do that. Basically, from this standpoint, because it's kind of at the end of the day, sort of a statistical use, the model, the more points we have, whether or not they're necessarily real, kind of gives us a better estimate of what's going on across the space. And so it's not necessarily a downside if we have wells that are no longer in use in this particular application.
But, you know, in fact, there are parts of the valley where there are too few wells really to get
Yeah.
a reasonable,
Right.
because you're not correct at the well level. If you got 5 wells in a township, it's a problem.
Yeah, which is sort of another issue that, you know, just in terms of these wells that we're using are based off of the completion reports. And so if there are not many wells in NP status because there's not many wells in reality, meaning that people are not really accessing that water for drinking.
Right.
So that's sort of probably in Tessa's court, but some future discussions about some of those areas. Potentially.
In Tessa's court, because they're policy questions.
It's a policy question. Exactly. So that's the groundwater model. Any other questions before? I know this is fairly technical, so thanks for sticking with me on this.
I apologize for the technical issues. These slides are not showing on the Zoom webinar.
Oh.
Fixed.
Oh, okay, should we?
So
do
we got it now. We're good.
Okay.
You got it, okay, good.
Would you advance to the next slide, please? I think this thing's still,
Still not working?
yeah, unless I just have the wrong button.
Luckily, I've seen him a few times, so I was okay. I knew what Ken was saying.
Yeah, she's probably heard this more times than she'd care to. So just another note on recharge specific to your subbasin. And some more nuance about NPSAT. Basically what it operates under is a steady state assumption. That's what allows it to be super efficient computationally, allows to look way out into the future pretty easily. So basically what the assumption is that pumping is equal to recharge. So the whole model is running sort of steady state. Modeling nuance, we can get into it if you want, but I just kind of wanted to make that clear. In terms of what actual recharge information we pulled out of C2V sim, we took the long-term average for their whole calibrated period, right? So I think that goes back, oh geez, I should know this, sorry. It's either, I think it's in the early 80s, it may be as far back as the 70s, but I believe it's early 80s up through 2015 is the calibrated period. So we took the long-term average for that, right? And so if over time those numbers look different as a function of sigma or whatever, we can include that. But what we're trying to do right now is use the best available information we have, right? And obviously recharge is really important to this whole picture because that's where concentration comes from, right? If you have more or less water, that's going to kind of control how much nitrate loading can be sort of managed. One step we did with Thomas and his team to sort of refine, if you will, C2V sim's information was to basically take a recharge pattern from SWAT, which has a lot of detail, right? It has crop, soil, climate management information. We use that pattern to sort of spread out the recharge in C2V sim in a more realistic way. And so you can see up here, sort of the coarse pixels, usually about 0.6 mile to 1 square mile pixel size in C2V sim. And then we take that same water budget. We don't change the total volumes or anything, but we spread it out across the subregions, consistent with SWAT's recharge. And so it's probably hard for you all to see, but there's a lot of irrigated ag right here. There's a lot of green you can see from aerial imagery. but recharge numbers are kind of low, right? And that's probably not the case, right? And so spreading out that recharge with SWAT gives us a more realistic picture, gives us a more realistic spreading of that water with more detail than DWR was able to sort of incorporate at this time. So just sort of an enhancement, if you will, of existing public information. So what did we submit to the regional board? Again, there's the milestones. And what milestones are, those are really, intended to ensure that ag is moving toward the direction of reducing the amount of nitrate N that may be reaching below the root zone. Doesn't necessarily mean compliance, but it's moving towards compliance, right? And I'll tell you how we came up with them in a moment here, but essentially it's based on the root zone, right? It's based on what growers have reported over time, and it's intended to sort of identify sort of the least efficient areas that we think could probably do better with sort of a reasonable amount of outreach and education, right? We're not trying to set milestones that are very difficult. They're intended to be something that we believe that hopefully folks would be able to achieve with some education and some improvements, infrastructure, and whatever else. And then of course there's the actual targets themselves based on the NPSAT. Those are for complying with receiving water. And I should mention in our report, we're very clear that these targets are, we submitted them because we have to, but we're very clear that they're uncertain, right? There's uncertainty in hydrology, there's uncertainty in other end loads, there's uncertainty. Each one of these steps has its own component of uncertainty, right? And so what that means is your target becomes uncertain. And so we fully acknowledge that these are based on our best available information, but to the degree that we can improve any one of these pieces, we will do that over time. Our targets will get more and more and more accurate as we're able to do that. And so that's very much reiterated in the report. You could probably control F uncertainty and find 100 counts of it in the document. So in terms of the milestones, what did we do? Basically, we took 4 years of grower data, INP data, and we know that they're fairly simple, right? But baked into those INPs is all the nuance that we know ultimately drives your nitrogen balance, right? What's going on with the crop? How is it managed? What climate and soil was that crop grown in? All of that. It's all baked in, right? And so if we look at a whole population of reports over multiple years, we get a pretty good idea of what's going on across the valley, what growers in the valley are able to achieve, right? And so basically all we do is there's some back and forth and deliberating how exactly to do this. And it's pretty simple. But if you were to just sort, say you take, processing tomato, right? You take all your reports for 4 years across the whole valley and you sort them from your smallest A-R to your largest. And then you just tally up the acreage with each report, right? And so what we can see is, okay, 50% of the acres is able to achieve this A-R on average. 75% of the acres are able to achieve this much. And most crops, when you look at them, have a similar pattern, right? So you see a pretty linear increase for most of the acreage, and then there's this tail, right? So the end, for the 95th percentile or whatever, that's a much higher end balance than say what, 3/4 of the acreage are able to do, right? And so in terms of prioritization, moving the needle, focusing resources and outreach, let's start here, right? This is the easiest place. It's all going to be hard, but this is the most logical place to start working and seeing if we can shift the industry. And so we basically built these graphs, determined what that A-R is at 75%, and applied that for each crop in the township, and basically came up with a milestone that is basically saying, okay, if anyone above this number, what would loading be if they just got back to that number? So that's it, sort of in a nutshell.
And the milestones kind of don't have a lot of regulatory force, if I'm right. They're kind of a tool for the coalitions or the folks in a township to sort of use as an agronomic guideline. It's an agronomic guideline that comes out of grower reported data. Right? It doesn't come out of some theory.
Right. And this basic framework or some adaptations framework could be used by the coalitions to prioritize your activities and your outreach and figure out how you want to go about trying to tackle this piece. So here on the left-hand side, we're showing the values again in pounds per acre of average load. And then on the right-hand side, we're showing the milestones, and they're expressed as just a % load reduction of the value, right? So is the milestone somewhere between 1 and 5% lower than the value, or is it 16 to 20, or is it a lot? And you'll see that not all townships have milestones. The idea here is that we only put forward milestones where they were applicable. So, you know, plainly put, if the target was easier than the milestone, we didn't put forward a milestone because the target will get you to compliance. You don't need a milestone to get there. There's no fundamental purpose for them as far as groundwater protection goes. So you can see the distribution here. You know, there's quite a bit of opportunity. Again, just trying to get those growers back to what 3/4 of the acreage are more or less able to do. And you can see on the aggregate township scale that there's opportunity, you know, anywhere from a couple percent up to more than 20% of load reduction just by reducing that A-R to what everyone else is able to do. So not intended to be super restrictive or challenging, at least intended, and really helps the industry move. It's got to go. Any questions or comments on this?
Saying that all those areas though need to still reduce, they're all the townships because they are less than, or the whole area
So any township with color basically,
needs to be reduced, but then you said there's targets for everybody else.
yeah, I can show you the targets on the next slide if you'd like to see them. But yes, effectively, for these townships that don't have a milestone, either they don't need to reduce, they need to maintain status quo, or basically the target, the number that they're trying to get out to based on NPSAT is actually easier than trying to implement the milestone. So there'd be no purpose for having a milestone that's more restrictive than a target in terms of loading.
Yeah. We want the milestones to be a tool, not a burden.
Yeah,
And so if we produce a number that says, if everybody gets back to the 75th percentile, you could do better than the target. Well, you don't need to do, the regulations don't require you to do better than the target. So we don't want that number. We don't want to generate that number because it could inadvertently become an obligation and further restrict your fertilizer use. More so than the water quality analysis indicates you would ever have to address your water quality issues.
so this is sort of the easier part of the story, I guess. Getting into targets. Again, what I'm showing on the left-hand side is the values, and on the right-hand side again is showing the % load reduction needed to hit those targets. So as you get yellow, orange, and red, targets become more difficult from a percentage standpoint. In terms of how challenging they are. And so you can actually see, hopefully you can see, it might be a little hard. There's a number of townships that I've basically applied this hatch here to the township to indicate that those targets are just to maintain status quo. So where they're at currently with the value is based on our current modeling sufficient for them to be protected with water quality. Right, so the target is just to keep doing what you're doing. And then for all other townships, some amount of load reduction is modeled to be needed to actually protect water quality in the future.
Can I just step in real quick, Ken? So just one important component about the targets, and I'm going to apologize, I'm going to have to jump off here shortly, but just to make sure that people have the proper context as far as the targets and when, you know, they're under the irrigated lands program, they are not regulatory endpoints, right? They're targets, they're not a limit. The further overlay that I think it's important for us to remember is the management zone implementation plans that you're currently working on for your priority 1 area, which is probably all of this area. This is where we're going to be looking to get ourselves 35 years for meeting those reductions or for meeting those targets. So I just want to make sure that there's the context that it's not anticipated that this has to happen instantaneously or within even the next 5 years, but this is why We're looking at the management zone implementation plans and looking to obtain that 35-year compliance timeframe to meet these targets to protect receiving water limits. So just wanted to add that in.
Thank you, Tess. So these are them. I'm not sure if folks have any questions or comments. We have a couple more slides on general information, but in terms of the actual, bottom line of the analysis, this is sort of how it's shaking out from a target standpoint.
Why do you have the GSAs on there? Are they anticipated to be participating in this, or is this?
Yeah.
So I asked him to add the GSAs as, there's a potential that, we might want to think about, the ones that have the higher percentages that need to be reduced. We want to maybe start some conversations about, does it make sense to fallow any land in these areas to reduce some of our nitrate usage? It's not, nothing's written in stone. It's just, those are the areas that are the highest. What kind of conversations need to be had to start looking at how we're going to bring these numbers down in the near future and in the far future.
I think to add to that, to the degree that, GSAs and their GSPs may, result in a different picture in terms of recharge and hydrology than, we currently understand in C2B, to the degree that that's different. Implementation of managed aquifer recharge or shifts in land use or whatever that change is, that can be readily incorporated into this framework. And so just kind of wanted to give that heads up that, we fully anticipate refining our modeling. And that's one key piece of the puzzle is recharge. And so as that evolves, we can accommodate that.
Question. As we move into wetter times, hopefully, water levels coming up, these levels are going to be diminished because this is a snapshot of what year. This is a snapshot of?
So it's based on a long-term average hydrology. So it's like basically a 30-year recharge picture.
No, I mean, what you've got there as far as values.
Sure. So good question. So the values currently are based upon the 2019 INMP reports. And I don't think any final decisions have been made yet, but the coalitions are looking into, how regularly or frequently those values will be updated. And over time, once there are multiple years worth of values, we could start looking at rolling averages or 3 years after, the picture can get, more into focus, but this is what we had at the time and sort of what we had to work with.
And 2019 was the old templates, correct? The more
There's some had adapted, but there's INMPs and NMPs.
Just to be clear, when you say reduction, you talk about reduction of load, not a
Pound per acre. Yeah. Pound per acre.
Not an applied fertilizer necessarily.
Right.
That's one knob you can turn.
Exactly. Yeah, if you can, there's many ways to try to get there.
In fact, I think, Mark, this, since the program started, we've really tried to focus on, we know production is why people apply fertilizer, why people farm, how they improve their bottom line. So the way we think about this is recovery of nitrogen into crop to make good, bigger crops, and not necessarily reductions in fertilizer that result in suboptimal yields. That doesn't mean that the latter will never happen, but we really want to construct the program that aligns pretty well with what our growers' business goals are.
So Tess touched on some of this already. The milestones and the targets, they're not enforceable metrics, right? They're not limits, they're different than that. The state board may in the future consider it what are appropriate enforceable metrics. We're obviously not there yet, and hopefully we never get there. But that is a potential possibility for the future. And in terms of how these sort of get integrated into the coalition framework, as you're all probably well aware, these coalitions are required to set up these groundwater quality management plans and implement them. As part of these GQMPs, there are schedules and milestones for implementation of practices. The GQMPs must include performance goals. And basically, these targets are going to be considered a performance goal. So the targets will get integrated into the GQMP, a plan, an outreach plan for implementation will be put in place. And that's kind of on a coalition by coalition basis in terms of how you want to go about that. But that's sort of where it plugs into the existing regulatory framework that you guys are operating within. And then just in terms of some general high level options, and we'd be happy to talk more about this now or at any other point. Some options for achieving the milestones and targets. As I kind of mentioned, right, what are the milestones? They're really just intended to help coalitions understand, where they can potentially prioritize outreach and education, right? Try to help implementation of practices, protective practices, and start moving the needle towards those targets. So it's a great prioritization tool for you all to use and inform your processes. Obviously there's a huge need for outreach, right? Not only on the grower side for understanding sort of this program and what it potentially means for them, but also on the advisor side. And so there's a lot of growers out there, there's a lot of irrigators, a lot of fields, right? And it's a huge task that could really probably only be achieved if you have a lot of coordination across and amongst all the advisors that, help growers make decisions, right? So engage in CCA, PCA communities, working with UC advisors. CDFA, I'm not sure if you're aware, is basically they're hiring staff directly to support ILRP needs by growers. So there is a network, and sort of our game plan under the MPEP anyways is to try to engage and rally and leverage that whole sort of network and institution to try to help growers meet the targets.
Are the CDFAs, aren't those actually technically UC staff that are hired? They're hired through the CIG,
Yes.
right? So CDFA is routing money to University of California to get these hyper-focused farm advisors that should be supporting the coalitions through this process with good technical advice, or supporting the CCAs and PCAs that advise growers, all of the above. Yeah, sure.
Obviously, many entities, including yourselves, are sort of invested in outreach activities. And so to the degree that there can be coordination and alignment, across the MPEP, across 13 coalitions, commodity boards, public institutions, kind of similar to that second bullet, right? Just getting the word out there is obviously the first piece, and then figuring out how to, go from there is next. You guys are all obviously well aware of, sort of funding opportunities that may be, I know there's an agenda item, so I won't go too much into the values of the SWEET program. But basically, to a degree that, funds can be, awarded to help growers implement these practices, make updates to their irrigation infrastructure, whatever it is, leveraging that. There's a lot of money out there, I guess is the short of it, especially on the federal side and the state side too. So taking advantage of that. And then something that is really critical that through the MPEP we're promoting a lot is sort of the use of decision support tools. These tools are, developed often by folks like UC. They're usually free. There's paid versions too, but you can get free tools and software that really help kind of integrate all the information that's going to really matter in terms of affecting where nitrate goes in a root zone, and help growers make decisions, right? Integrate climate information, integrate your soil information. How much water can your soil even hold? Integrate crop information. How much demand is there for fertilizer and water at a given time of year? Having all of that at your fingertips might help you make a decision about when to irrigate, how much to irrigate, when to fertilize, and so on and so forth. And so having just decision support at the grower's fingertips is going to be a resource for them to manage what they are doing.
I just want to say, add to that. One thing that I've always found kind of problematic is that, so many little places you've got to go to find information and widgets to make decisions about water budgets or nutrient management. It's just so disparate. It's a full-time job gathering it all together. Maybe your CCA has some tools that they've put together over the years so they can help, kind of convey some of that knowledge base to their client community. But the nice thing about some of these decisions to support tools that we're beginning to kind of work with the developers on is that they bring all of that together. So you don't have to go to 19 different places or maybe go to 2 different places and forget about the rest of it and say it's too complicated for me, depending on the type of operation you're running. Doesn't matter how big your operation is, the tool's just as good. Or somebody farming 50 acres is 500 or 5,000. So we really like the kind of convenience combined with quality. And that these things have the potential to bring us. And because of that graph that Ken showed you, the folks that are where you're trying to get to those milestones, people are going to want to know, where's the fat that I can cut without hurting myself. And that's really what these things are designed to tell you.
And then just final slide in terms of timeline and next steps. As we mentioned, they're not yet approved the targets. We're sort of having ongoing discussions with regional board staff. The regional board staff will brief the actual regional board during the April meeting in Bakersfield. And so sort of prepping for that a little bit, I guess. They are more than us. But that's sort of a key point on the timeline there. Again, once targets are approved, sort of annual progress reporting will be required. And under the GWPs, the milestones and targets, milestones where they exist, and the targets will need to be sort of integrated. And as I've said a few times now, the targets themselves will be reviewed and revised as needed on a 5-year basis. So it's about the most we could say in terms of where things are at, I guess. Other than I think conversations are going pretty favorably with the regional board about targets themselves.
Questions from anybody?
Hey, Ken, if you go back up like 3 slides, you had a map, I think. And everything south of that, where the colors end, that's de-designated on the MUN side.
Nicely.
And then you got that one yellow square there, I think that's also in the MUN, I think, but is there a reason that
Over there.
On the left hand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yellow, blue, whatever.
Yeah, sure. So I guess if we have NMP data and a value and a target, it's not de-designated. And at least some fraction of it maybe.
A very small portion.
Yeah, but the other thing to note is that, the target equals the value. So maintaining status quo in that case is sufficient to be protected. Yeah.
Any other questions? Good enough. Thank you.
Thank you for the time.